On a March morning in 1603, in a privy chamber at Richmond Palace, a woman who had ruled England for 44 years gave one last order about her own body. No one was to open it. No surgeon, no embalmer, no anatomist was to make the first incision that every royal corpse of her century expected. She had spent a lifetime deciding what the world was permitted to see of her. Her final decision was that the thing under the skin would stay unseen. Forever. That order is the first thing a pathologist would want to overrule, because a body sealed by the person who lived inside it is a body with an answer worth hiding. Sometimes guilt, sometimes only vanity, sometimes fear. But when the dead leave instructions that the examination must not happen, the examination becomes the one thing you find yourself wanting. She did not get one. That is the strange fact at the center of this case. Not because the order held, because of what happened to it. So we are going to do the thing she forbade. Not with a scalpel, with the record. The subject is female, 69 years old at the time of death. Died in the early hours of the 24th of March, 1603, at Richmond Palace, west of London. She had worn the crown of England since the 17th of November, 1558. 44 years and 4 months. The last monarch of the House of Tudor. Her name was Elizabeth. The first English queen to carry that name and rule in her own right. Daughter of Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Half-sister to Mary I and to the boy King Edward VI. I have had her mother on this table, and her father, and both of those half-siblings. This is the last of that family to die, and the only one of them to reach old age at all. Let me be precise about who this is, because the name is crowded in these files. This is not Elizabeth of York, the grandmother who married the first Tudor king. This is the queen herself, 69 years old, 44 years on the throne, dead in her own bed, and buried on terms she did not set. Cause of death per the historical record, natural decline, a great age, a deep melancholy, a broken spirit. That is the verdict her century wrote, and it has more or less stood. There was an autopsy for none of it. What we are doing is rebuilding one from the two records beyond her control, the record of her living body which hundreds of people saw for decades, and the record of what happened to that body after she was dead, which proved far harder to control than she guessed. Cause of death, mechanism, manner, time. For 400 years the story stayed simple. The Virgin Queen died of grief. She had outlived nearly everyone. Robert Dudley, the great favorite of her youth, dead since 1588. Her counselors, her spy master, her cousin on the Scottish throne, executed on her own warrant. And in February of 1601, she had signed the death warrant of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, the last young man she had let close. 2 years after that, she stopped eating, refused her bed, sat on cushions on the floor with a finger near her mouth, and sank into a silence that ended in her death. Grief. Melancholy. An old woman who simply let go. That is one tidy story. The other story is newer, and it has taken over the internet. Elizabeth was poisoned by her own face. 60 years of white paint spread across her skin to keep her looking young, leaching into her body and rotting her from the outside in. The makeup killed the queen. It is a satisfying story because it carries a moral. Vanity is a slow suicide. 2 clean explanations: grief or the paint. Neither was ever tested against a body because nobody who touched this corpse was looking for a cause of death. So before we accept either, we read what we actually have. And what we have is not the corpse. It is something stranger. It is 40 years of witnesses describing a living woman who was, layer by layer, turning herself into an object. The face on this case is no death mask. It is a mask she built while she was still breathing. Start with the external examination, the way any report starts. Except here, that examination runs across decades, and the skin keeps changing under our eyes. The substance is called Venetian ceruse. In her own century, they sometimes called it the spirits of Saturn, and Saturn was the alchemist's name for lead. The recipe is simple. White lead, a carbonate of it, ground fine and worked with vinegar into a smooth, pale paste. Spread thin across the face, the throat, and the upper chest, it dried to a flat, luminous, almost porcelain white. In the light of a quart, it read as youth, as purity, as something above the ordinary red and weathered faces around her. It also happened to be a heavy metal salt applied daily to the largest organ the body has. She did not invent the practice. Every fashionable woman at that court painted, but few of them painted for as long as she did, or with as much at stake, or over a specific injury that changed everything. In the autumn of 1562, at Hampton Court, Elizabeth caught smallpox. She was 29. For a few days the court believed she would die, and men argued in the corridors about who would take the throne if she did. She survived, but smallpox leaves its mark. It scars. The record and the tradition both hold that from that illness onward, the painting stopped being fashion and became concealment. The white layer went on thicker, and it stayed on. There is a detail from that illness that tells you exactly what smallpox meant to the people around her. The woman who nursed the Queen through it, Mary Sidney, the sister of Robert Dudley, caught the disease from her patient. Elizabeth recovered with her face largely intact. Mary Sidney did not. Her husband wrote afterward that he had left a wife at court as fair as any he had seen, and came back to a woman the pox had wrecked. She withdrew from public life. Smallpox in that century was no scare. It was a coin flip on your face. And the Queen had watched up close what the losing side looked like. That is the first thing 60 years of lead cosmetics did. It turned a court fashion into a daily medical exposure. Call it 50 years of it if you count from the young woman at a dangerous court. Closer to 60 if you count from the girl who first learned to paint before she was ever a queen. Either way, it is most of a life spent putting a heavy metal on her face on purpose. Now the skin under the paint. The mechanism itself is cruel, and it is the reason a pathologist pays any attention to cosmetics at all. The carbonate on skin is corrosive. It dries the surface. It inflames it. It damages the very complexion it is meant to perfect. So the skin gets worse. And when the skin gets worse, the answer, in that world, is more ceruse to cover it. The paint creates the damage that demands the paint. It is a closed loop. It runs for years, and it ends only when the wearer stops, or dies. By the last decade of her life, the descriptions of the woman under the paint are descriptions of ruin, not youth. Skin gone gray and creased beneath a hard white surface. A face that could stay hidden and nothing more. I have read this pattern before. Not in a museum. I remember a woman who came to my table one winter in a quiet county in eastern Kentucky who read a full 20 years older than the age on her paperwork. The skin was the tell. Ruined. Thin. Prematurely aged in a way that fit nothing in her medical history. Until we found the history that mattered. For years she had been putting a homemade compound on her face and her arms, sold to her as a lightening cream, that turned out to be loaded with a heavy metal. She was poisoning herself politely in the mirror every morning in the name of looking better. The exterior told the story before any lab did. That is the shape here. A person whose most intimate daily ritual was a slow dose. The mask explains the face. Whether it explains the death is a different question, and only an opened body could have answered it. Keep going through the exterior because the paint was only part of her exposure. The hair. In her later years, Elizabeth wore wigs tightly curled and famously red, and she owned a great many of them, more than most women went through in a lifetime. Hair loss has many causes at that age. Chronic metal exposure is one of them. Smallpox is another. and the wigs were doing the same work as the paint, covering a body that was thinning and failing under the image. The mouth. A German visitor to the court in 1598, a lawyer named Paul Hensner, left a description that historians still quote. He noted that the queen's teeth were black, and he offered a cause that had nothing to do with the metal. He blamed sugar. The English, he wrote, used too much of it, and their teeth paid for it. Imported sugar was a luxury the rich could afford to ruin themselves with, and the Queen could afford more of it than anyone in England. So the black teeth are real, and they are on the record, but honesty means filing them under sugar and away from the paint. Not every defect in this body traces to the metal. A good examination resists making one villain do all the work. Put the exterior together and you have a woman aging normally in some ways and abnormally in others, carrying at least 2 chronic insults on top of her years. Sugar in the mouth, lead on the skin, and very likely mercury as well, because the era's cosmetics ran past a single metal. Sublimate of mercury was used to peel and lighten skin, and mercury salts colored the reds that went on lips and cheeks. Whatever the exact mixture on her face in any given year, it was a chemistry set, and it was absorbing. Let me be careful about what that absorption does, because this is where the popular story runs ahead of the medicine. Metal taken in through the skin is real, but it is slower and weaker than metal that is swallowed. It builds over years, not weeks. In the body, it interferes with the making of blood. It settles into bone, and at a high enough burden, it reaches the nerves, producing fatigue, irritability, a dulling of the mind, sometimes a colic deep in the gut. Mercury adds its own signature on top, tremor and mood disturbance chief among them. A woman wearing both daily for decades is a genuine candidate for chronic low-grade poisoning. What she is not, on that evidence alone, is a proven case of it. Chronic toxicity here is a reading the living record supports, and one a proper examination could have confirmed or thrown out. That examination never happened. The paint was only the part of the disguise that touched skin. The rest of it hung on the walls of every great house in England. In her final decades, the Queen's own likeness was standardized into a single ageless face, a pattern art historians now call the Mask of Youth, worked up by miniaturists like Nicholas Hilliard and copied outward across the country. Unflattering portraits were discouraged, and some were destroyed. The court refused to paint a woman near 70. It painted an idea immune to age, and the idea was enforced. If reading a body this way, from the record up, with no scalpel and no shortcuts is the kind of work you want more of, the subscribe button is where you tell me so. Another shut case gets opened on this channel most weeks. Now the last chapter of The Living Body, the spring of 1603. The decline is unusually well witnessed because a queen dies in public even when she is trying to hide it. A courtier named Robert Carey left an account of her final days. A young law student named John Manningham recorded her death in his diary within hours of it. From those and others, a clinical picture assembles. She had grown frail through the winter. In March, a sore throat and a deepening weakness set in. She refused her bed, refused food, refused the physicians, and stood or sat propped up for long stretches, sunk in a melancholy so heavy her counsel could scarcely reach her. There is one physical detail from her last months a pathologist keeps. The coronation ring she had worn since the start of her reign, the ring that stood for her marriage to England, had over 44 years grown into the flesh of her finger. The skin had closed over the gold. In her final year, it had to be filed off her finger, worked free of the flesh it had fused with. A body does that slowly, silently, across decades, and you notice only when it is far too late to undo. The ring had become part of her the same way the paint had. Both had to be taken off her by force at the end. The mouth and throat stayed involved to the last. She could not, or would not, swallow. And in the early hours of the 24th of March, she died quietly. Manningham wrote that she went mildly, like a lamb, and easily, like a ripe apple falling from a tree. Read that as a case file, and grief drops out of the cause line. where it always was a poor fit. Grief is a mood, not a mechanism. What the description actually holds is an aged, depleted woman with an infected throat she struggled to clear, sinking over weeks into a spreading infection and a failing chest. The modern candidates are specific: a streptococcal infection of the throat, the kind that can abscess behind the tonsil and seed the blood, a bronchopneumonia settling into old lungs, blood poisoning with the throat as its source. Any of those, in a body of 69 with decades of chronic exposure and a will that had stopped fighting, is enough to end it. Grief is none of them. All of them are the sort of thing an autopsy is built to tell apart, which is where this case does something singular. The order she gave was overruled, and the body still ended up unreadable. Line the two stories up against what we have. The grief story is lazy, more than false. It took a woman's mood and called it her cause of death, skipping the throat entirely. The makeup story is the opposite error. It took a real, documented, decades-long poisoning of the skin and inflated it into the thing that stopped her heart, on evidence no pathologist could ever sign, because nobody ever wrote down what was inside her. Both stories wanted one clean villain. The body, as usual, was carrying more than one thing at once, and it would have said so if anyone had let it speak. Then there is the coffin itself, and this is where the shut drawer speaks. One of her maids of honor, a woman named Elizabeth Southwell, later left an account of the days between the death and the funeral. Southwell had by then converted to Catholicism and had her own reasons to write the old queen down, so the account comes with a warning label, and serious historians treat it with real caution. But the physical claim inside it earns a pathologist's attention. Southwell wrote that the body lay in state in its lead coffin at Whitehall, and that one night during the vigil the coffin burst, splitting the wood and the lead with a crack the watching ladies heard. The body, she implied, had gone into that shell unpreserved. Here the record turns, and it turns against her. Robert Cecil, whatever the Queen had wished, left orders with the surgeons to open her and rode for London to proclaim James king. Her body was embalmed after all. Her last command was overruled within hours of her death by the man who had run her government. And the coffin cracked anyway. That is the detail that makes Southwell's account worth keeping. A corpse putrefies from the gut outward. The bacteria that lived in the intestine keep working after death, and they generate gas. Closed inside a rigid lead shell, that gas has nowhere to go. Pressure builds. The whole reason royal embalmers removed the organs was to prevent exactly this. The women watching that night reportedly said afterward that if the Queen had not been opened, it would have been far worse. A superficial embalming on a body already breaking down bought the coffin a few days and no more. A body that is read gives up its secrets on the table. This one gave them up in a crack in the dark, heard by 6 women on a night watch, written down years later by a witness with an axe to grind. That is what is left when the examination is never made. This is how the report reads. Cause of death. On the best available evidence, an acute infection. Most plausibly a streptococcal infection of the throat progressing to blood poisoning, or a bronchopneumonia in a woman of 69 worn down by age, by a long melancholy, and by decades of chronic exposure to lead and mercury through her cosmetics. I want to be honest about the limits of that reading. Without a real examination on the record, the infection is the strongest reading, and short of a certainty. The metal is a documented lifelong insult and a plausible contributor to her general decline. Signing it as the thing that killed her goes further than I can. The people who say the makeup poisoned the Queen are pointing at something real, and then claiming far more than the evidence will bear. Mechanism of death. Sepsis, or respiratory failure, in an aged and depleted body with almost nothing left in reserve to fight. Manner of death. Natural. Everything in this record points one direction. No violence. No poison in the deliberate sense. No hand on her but her own century's chemistry and her own age. Time of death. The early hours of the 24th of March, 1603, at Richmond. Now the refile, because the record keeps this death under two wrong headings at once. It is filed under grief, which is a feeling rather than a finding. And it is filed in the popular imagination, under death by lead cosmetics, a verdict no opened body ever delivered. The correct classification is a natural death by infection in an aged body, with chronic cosmetic toxicity standing as a documented insult and an unproven contributor. What 60 years of lead DID is visible and real. It ruined the skin it promised to perfect. It deepened the disguise year over year. It stands as a plausible thread running through her long decline. What it never did, on any evidence a pathologist can defend, is stand alone as the cause. And the reason for that uncertainty is the single most important fact in the whole file. There is a version of this examination that could have been definitive. It never happened. Surgeons did open her on Cecil's order and against her wish, but they opened her to preserve a corpse for 3 weeks of lying in state, not to find out what had killed a queen. No one wrote down what was inside her. No report survives. The one hand that went into this body was working to delay decay, not to read a cause of death, and it left the file exactly as empty as her order had intended. Why she gave the order, we know only in part, and I will not dress up the record as clean on it. Some read it as vanity, a woman who had hidden her body behind paint for a lifetime and would keep it off the slab. Some read it as fear of what the knife might find. Some point out that many a monarch went unopened, and that she may simply have wanted to be left whole. A pathologist takes the reading the evidence gives, flattering or otherwise. What I can say for certain is the cost. The order cost us the one examination that could have weighed the metal against the infection. It did not even buy her the thing she asked for. They opened her anyway, and the coffin cracked anyway. I have read a queen from the record alone before, for exactly this reason. Her half-sister Mary, who ruled before her, also went into the ground without an autopsy. Also rebuilt from what witnesses saw rather than what a knife could show. 2 queens, 2 shut cases. And 3 years after Elizabeth died, the man who took her throne moved her body and set it down on top of her sister's, the 2 of them sharing one tomb in Westminster Abbey. The inscription over them calls them partners in throne and in grave. 2 sisters resting in the hope of resurrection. Rivals in life, kept from the table in death, filed together at last. There is a thread that runs through this whole case, and it is control, not the metal. She ruled by controlling her own image so completely that the image outlived the woman. She built a mask while she was alive, and she forbade anyone to look behind it once she was dead. The makeup was part of that. So was the order. So was the story that leaked out of the coffin when she was past stopping it. Cause of death is the medical answer, and here it is, a careful, hedged, honest one, because she made certain it could stay nothing more. Manner of death is the human answer. And the human answer is that a woman who spent almost 70 years deciding what could be seen of her gave one last order about her own body, and was overruled inside a day by her own Secretary of State. She is the subject who refused the table. She was carried to it anyway by men who wanted a corpse presentable for 3 weeks of mourning. They took what she was hiding and told no one what they saw. Her refusal failed, and the file stayed empty regardless. If a body came to you, sealed by the decedent's own dying command, with the living record showing 40 years of a metal that visibly ruined the skin, and the final weeks showing an aging, infected throat in a body with nothing left in reserve, which line would you sign as the cause? And would you honor the order, or would you open her? Tell me what you would have written across the top of this one. Thanks for watching.